The GeriPal podcast is brought to you by Archstone Foundation, preparing society and meeting the needs of an aging population. And now, here are your hosts.
Welcome to the GeriPal podcast. This is Eric Wadera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, who is our guest today?
Returning. We're delighted to have Dani Chammas, who's a psychiatrist and palliative care doctor at UCSF. Welcome back to the GeriPal podcast. This is your third time?
Third time.
Third time's a charm. Delighted to have you back.
Delighted to be back.
And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about emotional PPE for front lines of coronavirus. Dani, we're going to be talking about donning and doffing emotions.
Oh, we can if you want to.
Well, we'll talk about what the heck emotional PPE is. But before we do you have a song request for Alex?
Yeah, my song request is I Got You, Babe by Sonny and Cher.
And why I Got You, Babe by Sonny and Cher?
Because I'm really hoping that our colleagues on the front lines know that, like, we got you, babes.
That's good. I like the babes.
Yeah.
Let's hear it, Alex.
They say we're young and we don't know. We won't find out until we grow. Well, I don't know if all that's true, 'cause you got me and baby, I got you. I got you, babe. I got you, babe. I got you, babe. All right. I should have changed it to I Got You, Babes.
Yeah. Maybe at the end.
Well, Dani, I want to thank you for coming on our show. For those listeners who haven't listened to your podcast that you did on therapeutic presence in the time of COVID, really strongly encourage our listeners to listen to that. Today, we're going to be talking about emotional PPE in the era of coronavirus. Before we get deep dive in emotional PPE, what do we mean by that?
What do you mean by that? Well, Eric, for weeks, we've been having this intense discussion around the need for personal protective equipment, right? PPE, to help protect frontline workers who are working with the sick. And we have been talking about masks and gowns and shields and all the physical gear that protects from infection. And I've been seeing a growing movement that people want to broaden this, not just from physical PPE, but from emotional PPE. And I wish I knew who to credit. I don't know exactly who first gave birth to this phrase, but I've seen it in a few contexts now from colleagues in mental health that are taking on efforts at their institution to make programs and interventions that focus on protecting the emotional and psychological health and intactness of healthcare workers on the front lines of this pandemic. My hope, I'll add, is that this concept gets discussed sort of far and wide.
And to provide some more context, we have headlines about doctor committing suicide. She tried to do her job and it killed her father, and it killed her, said the father of Dr. Lorna Breen, who worked in a Manhattan hospital hit hard by the coronavirus outbreak. This is from the New York Times. I believe you've heard of other, Hio goes on, she was in the trenches on the front line, he said, make sure she's praised as a hero because she's a casualty as much as anyone else who died. And I heard that this is not an isolated incident. You've heard, Dani, of other healthcare workers in the front lines who have struggled emotionally and even committed suicide.
Yeah, I was just reading about, an EMT also in New York who recently killed himself under similar, extremely distressing conditions that he was exposed to. And I don't know how you guys feel when you hear those stories, but I know I get this really uncomfortable feeling in my chest when we lose someone to suicide, right? I'm just grappling with what could we have done, right? How could we have protected you? but yeah, far and wide.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably, suicide is probably it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? Like this is the the extreme, when it gets to this point, when someone feels like they can't go on living any further and end their life. But it's just a sign of this deep, hidden from view, the rest of the iceberg, which is all of this, emotional pain, suffering, moral injury, I don't know what the words are. Help us find the right words to describe what it is we're feeling.
What are we dealing with, Dani?
What are we doing? Well, because I want to get into the meat of emotional PPE, but I think you guys are right. Let's do a little bit of sort of laying the groundwork, background stuff before we get there. And you guys are always good sports. So if you guys are game, I'd actually love to throw out a couple of statements at you and ask you to let me know if you think they're true or false. What do you think?
Okay,
yeah?
We're game.
True. Okay,
easy enough.
ready.
Okay, true. No pressure, but also don't mess this up. Okay.
I feel like I'm playing code names. We were playing a lot of code names at home with another family on Zoom. So I feel like this is just like that.
Okay. 5 statements. Here I go. Statement number 1.
Crush Alex.
You're going to crush him. Statement number 1, true or false? The psychological footprint of a disaster like a pandemic deeply contributes to the morbidity and mortality, both during the disaster and long after it.
Maybe. More data. Studies are indicated.
Maybe is not an option.
Maybe from Eric. Alex, do you think you can beat him?
True.
True. Alex is the winner. Yeah, history has taught us this one time and again. All right, good job, Alex. Work harder, Eric. Statement 2, true or false? As we speak, many frontline medical workers are being impacted by deep sources of emotional distress. These are some of the things you're talking about, Alex. Trauma, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, moral injury, moral distress.
Mm-hmm.
True, but I don't know if I know all of the definitions for this.
So true is correct, but yeah, let's go ahead and define them. What is trauma? What a great question. When we're talking about trauma, I would say the strictest, most, clinical definition would be the DSM criteria of trauma, which says that a person is exposed to threatened or actual death, threatened or actual serious illness, either by direct exposure or direct witnessing. Right? I would say that most of us in mental health kind of acknowledge that this clinical definition is pretty narrow, that there's a range of really distressing and disturbing things that can be experienced as traumatic. So when we're thinking about a frontline worker, we're talking about, right, a tidal wave of death coming their way that they're not able to stop, right? Having to walk past overflowing, freezers of dead bodies to get into the hospital. All this stuff while also worrying, am I going to get sick? Am I going to get my family sick? What's coming next? Are we even at a peak? All of these things are really traumatic. When we talk about secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, it's basically indirect exposure to trauma by hearing people's firsthand accounts, right? We see this all the time in medicine. And then moral distress or moral injury is a unique thing. And it's this discrepancy that happens when one's core moral values are not aligned with what somebody is forced to either do or not do because of the constraints of their situation. Right? So this would be more along the lines of being forced to pick who gets life-saving care, right? Going to med school doesn't teach us how to deny people care that could save their lives. Being forced to tell a family they can't be with their loved one while that person dies, right? Then watching that person die alone. Being forced to work outside of your scope of practice in a way that you just don't feel adequate to do.
Yeah, or coding a person who you feel has near zero chance of resuscitation, and you feel like you're doing harm to this person in their last moments of life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was talking just yesterday to a psych resident in New York who's been tasked with taking care of a super intense ICU case that they just didn't feel like they were trained to do. And repeatedly, this resident was telling me, I can't do this. I can't do this. And it was so distressing because they just were so aware of this feeling that they were hurting the person by not being able to give them the right kind of care. Joan Halifax. Oh, yeah, you go.
And so I'm just trying to think about this. Like in medicine, separate medicine and psychiatry. I know I probably shouldn't be saying that. But
you just got a lot of enemies there.
When we talk about trauma, we think about like trauma bay. Like they're coming to the emergency room. There's trauma. Exposure to trauma, like in my head, is like exposure to that type of medicine. I'm also hearing when we're thinking about it in psychiatry, there's this kind of broader emotional trauma that you're also talking about. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're talking about like trauma to the body, right?
It's a very very medicine-y thing. We try to devoid ourselves from all emotions. So
that's too funny. No, when we're talking about trauma in psychiatry, we're talking about the psychological experience of being exposed to what you're talking about. Right? So the psychological experience of thinking my life is on the line, or watching someone else, die or have their arm cut off, or whatever physical thing you're thinking about, we're just talking about the psychological experience of witnessing or experiencing it.
Yeah. I guess we also don't think that much of medicine, like the work that we do in the ICU or with dying patients, as that being traumatic. But it certainly sounds like it can be.
Certainly, yeah. And it's a good distinction, right? We're talking about trauma. We're talking about, vicarious trauma. We're talking about moral injury. These aren't new things, right, that COVID brought to us. It's just the intensity of how much of it we're having to take in right now is definitely upped for the people on the front line. So we're going to feel the impacts of it a lot more. So, and I'll add, this distinction is really important. But for the purposes of us talking, I think we're just going to have to think about all of these a little bit together. Really, anything that someone on the front lines is forced to experience or do or witness that has the potential to make them feel like their psychological, moral, or physical self is not intact.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be, because when you mention secondary trauma, that's not might not be people on the front lines. That might be, people who are hearing stories from colleagues about their experiences. Is that right?
Yeah, and I would say there's a sort of a spectrum, right? It's not like it is trauma or it isn't, right? Some of us are closer, some of us are farther, some of us get it, for longer, more intensity, some for less. So we're getting different doses. But yeah, secondary trauma, we see it a lot in therapists, right? We see it all the time because people have to sit and hear these terrible, terrible things happening to other people. But you can certainly have it just hearing the experiences of your colleagues and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, great. You got more true false for us?
I do.
Wait, where are we? I don't know if I got a chance to respond to that one. We'll count that as...
We'll count that one as a tie.
All right. Sounds good.
Number 3, true or false? Many more frontline workers are at risk of being exposed to similar emotionally distressing experiences in the coming weeks and months.
I see where we're going here. True.
Wait, many more frontline workers are at risk of being exposed in the coming months than
have already been exposed.
Okay. So we'll have more people coming in the coming months.
There's more to come. Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to say true as well. And the reason I say true, mine is data driven.
Yeah.
Is that if you look at the US as a whole, number of hospitalizations for coronavirus is going down. But if you take out New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, it's going up. So it's going down in the place that's been the epicenter, but the rest of the country, it's still rising.
Remind me to take you to trivia night the next time I go to trivia night.
I'm just using test-taking skills.
Okay.
I've learned who my professor is on this test, and I'm answering the way I think she would.
Oh, man. All right. True or false, then? Everybody exposed to these emotionally distressing experiences It's going to have significant emotional dysfunction as a result.
False.
Ah, good job. I told you not to mess it up and you didn't. False, right? This is because you guys work at the VA. So you see this all the time with veterans, right? Everybody is deeply affected by disturbing experiences. But we know from the literature that not everybody will respond in the same way, right? Some get emotional dysfunction, some don't.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been oh yeah.
Are there protective factors that we know about? Or are we going to get into that later?
Yeah, we are, because that's going to be what informs how we pick our PPE, right? Oh, so many people have asked this question, right? Why do some Israeli kids exposed to war get PTSD and others don't? And there are some factors there's nothing we can do about, right? Your genes, kind of stuck with those. Your personality, right? Your personal mental health history. There's very little we can do. But there are others that are totally modifiable and intervenable. And those are the ones we're going to be drawing on today when we think through what goes into emotional PPE.
Wait, can I hold you just sorry,
Yeah.
to interrupt. PTSD, you mentioned the term, post-traumatic stress disorder. Does that term apply to what we're talking about here? Or is that a specific term that's used for war or violence?
So PTSD is one thing that we're trying to protect from, but it's one of many potential outcomes from exposure to trauma, right? It's not even the most likely outcome from exposure to trauma. For many people, depression is a more likely outcome from exposure to trauma, but there are many places of emotional dysfunction that exposure to trauma can take you to, and PTSD is one of them. And it just happens to be the only one that actually requires exposure to trauma as part of its definition. The other ones you can get to via other routes, if you will.
Okay.
So it's one of the outcomes we are trying to protect people, one of many outcomes we're trying to protect people from.
Okay, thank you.
Fair? Yeah. All right, final quiz question. Winner takes all on this one. True or false? We have a moral imperative to not only protect the physical health of our colleagues. I should change the end of the statement now. Something
Help
terrible.
me out, Dani.
But to bathe them in Jello. No,
We have a moral imperative to ignore the distress of healthcare workers. I'm going to say false on that one.
Oh, man. But to protect to the best of our abilities their emotional health. It was true. Alex wins. But we joke, but I actually would argue that this is the most important of the questions, right? Because if it's our duty, then we have to get in action. Like we should have gotten in action like months ago at this point, or weeks ago.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of talk about the imperative to keep healthcare providers safe by having adequate PPE. And when we talk about that, we talk about adequate physical PPE. And you're arguing also that there is an imperative that we don this emotional PPE, and we have resources for this emotional PPE for healthcare workers.
Yeah. If anything, I'd say we have more resources. We just have to make use of them. But we can go there.
Okay, good. Well, yeah. So should we go there now? So, what is emotional PPE? What can we do?
What can we do? Well, I'm going to say that there's sort of like a golden caveat in mental health that we have to give credit to really quickly, which is that you can't tend to the psychological health of anybody if you haven't tended to their basic needs, right? This is sort of Maslow's thing. So before we go there, let's just all acknowledge together, like food, hydration, sleep, being able to go to the bathroom. I would say for frontline workers, I'd broaden that, like access to reliable childcare, right? Not wondering if you're going to have some kind of huge pay cut while you're working harder than ever and at great risk, right?
Right.
There's a lot of basics that have to be in place. But if we put those in place, if we say that those are like a given, then I would say the rest of what goes into emotional PPE falls into three main sort of organizing buckets in my head. This is when you can ask me about the bucket.
Oh, yeah.
What are the buckets?
What are the buckets? Great question. So I'm going to call the first bucket connection. Let's call it connection. What do you guys think might fall into the bucket of connection?
Maintaining contact with family, talking with your team as far as healthcare providers.
With your colleagues, particularly because I think it's harder. There are so many challenges to connection because social distancing requirements. Some of us are working from home, doing telephone work. And then
listening to your favorite podcast hosts.
That's good. Yeah, there you go.
Best one. Yeah.
Right. Connection with, because in palliative care and geriatrics, one of the reasons many of us went into this is because we love working in teams. And we may not be working in teams as much. My understanding is even for people who can go in to see patients who have COVID, they're sending one person in, not the whole team.
Yeah.
So connection with your team, connection with your family. We're talking about emotional connection here too.
Yeah, no, all of the above, right? So interpersonal connection is arguably one of the best, strongest psychological buffers to emotional distress that we have. And I think you guys are right on. Like, this virus is cruel because it is like the things we need to do to combat it are huge barriers to connection. So I think we have to be thinking about our frontline workers and the fact that the perception of being in the trenches together is always better than the perception of being in the trenches alone. Right? And all the things you talked about, I would add, when Alex, you said emotional connection, I think hand in hand is the idea of validation and empathy, right? Using our connection to validate. We know how powerful validation is, right? It helps people be seen, right? Especially validation that doesn't incite extra panic. And I would say sort of the flip side of validation's importance is the deep, deep risk that comes with invalidation at times of severe emotional distress. Right? So let's like go hypothetical together. Let's picture a colleague, let's say in New York on the front lines, right? Had just a grueling day. What kind of forms of invalidation, subtle or not subtle, do you think they might be experiencing?
Well, it could range from everything like, I think in New York in general, when people are supportive of healthcare workers, like on their way home from the hospital. But I've heard of cases, for example, in Mexico, where healthcare workers are actually ostracized because they're viewed as, vectors of disease, that they might actually be transmitting the virus, and have been, things thrown at them, assaulted. Like that's probably the epitome, the worst possible invalidation. Here you are working so hard on the front lines, and then you are ostracized from your community or assaulted because of it.
Yeah, that's definitely the extreme, right? And I hear what you're saying about gratitude being present in New York, but I'll give you a counter story. I have a friend who's a neurologist who works in New York. He's being asked to work sort of outside of the scope of his practice in the setting of his hospital being in crisis. And he put on a mask the other day and decided to go for a run because he really needed to de-stress. And as he ran through the city, he came across a group of people partying in the park, hanging out with each other as if nothing was going on. And he got the most intense emotional reaction to it. He was livid. He called me so pissed off. And I think what was really underneath it for him was this deep sense of disregard, of invalidation, right? Of a world acting like what he was going through wasn't even happening right now. Right? Then he probably went home, logged into Facebook and saw that Johnny from high school English class doesn't really get what the big deal is with this whole Corona thing, right?
Yeah.
Opened his email and got like an admin email saying, great job, everyone. We're going to need more hours, flipped on the news and listened to Trump talk.
Yeah.
Right? Like layer of subtle and not subtle invalidation all day long as they go through these experiences.
Yeah, some of these. So the example of the violence in Mexico was extreme, but it's almost like in the concept of microaggressions, for example. I think about this in terms of race or gender. You could make an analogy here, and maybe it's not even an analogy. Maybe these are sort of microaggressions about invalidating the experience of coronavirus or the science of it, or what healthcare workers are doing, putting themselves at risk and spending hours and emotional investment and trauma to go through.
And you can imagine going home after a shift in the ED in New York or in the ICU now, where a lot of the cases are, and having 60-70% of your hospital ICU now, COVID patients, and then seeing a post on Nextdoor that it's not much worse than the flu. Like, the flu doesn't do this, folks. The flu doesn't make 60% of your hospital COVID intubated patients.
Right? Yeah. So when we think of emotional PPE, right, like how do we make sure that these workers know that their experiences and sacrifices are seen, right? That their suffering is real.
How do you do that?
How do you? It's like the $1 million question.
Because the random emails from your hospital CEO, I'm guessing, is not the... like it's something.
It's something. Let's not take it away. It's a hard one to answer because you can do it on so many levels, right? Individuals reaching out to check in. Interdisciplinary means creating teams, creating like spaces to have regular meetings, right? All the way up to Schwartz rounds, right? Like Zoom Schwartz rounds that bring us together and have these like shared experiences be seen and validated. There's now this national anonymous physician support hotline that you can call 7 days a week, like almost all hours a day, and reach a volunteer psychiatrist if you need someone to like hear you out, right? And bear witness to what you're going through. This is also why I reached out to you guys, I think just last week after you did the GeriPal like love letter to our colleagues at Columbia. And the reason I reached out was because I'm so grateful for things right now that safeguard connection and validation.
Alex, we filled the bucket. Well, maybe we didn't fill it.
You put a penny in the bucket. I like it.
Teaspoon of water into the bucket.
Yeah.
Okay. Connection. One bucket.
Wait. Before we leave connection.
More to connection.
There's just like one other thing to say about connection, which is like just acknowledging the deep power of the language we choose, right? We talk a lot in palliative care about how important narratives are, because the narrative that a person writes can deeply impact how they experience a situation. So Alex, I'm going to give you 2 different lines. You can pick one and you can leave the other one for Eric. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Option number 1. Wow. You've been the victim of some deeply intense experiences this month. Option number 2. Wow. You've survived some deeply intense experiences this month.
And I'm supposed to pick the best one, or I'm supposed to pick one that I would use myself?
Which one would you rather put out into the world to a colleague on the front lines?
I would say the survived.
Yeah. Yeah, the survived, right? Like we know from all the trauma literature and things that people who come through a trauma with the self-concept of a survivor as opposed to being a victim do better emotionally, right? Our language has power. We talk about this all the time in palliative care, right? Our language helps us find meaning, right? Now more than ever, we have to be choosing the words, choosing the messages that are telling people, hey, we think what you're doing is heroic and brave and meaningful, even if you're having to come into contact with some really dark, not so pleasant things in the process.
And it sort of bolsters their sense of resiliency and praises them for getting through the tough time, rather than setting up the dynamic of victimhood and
powerlessness.
Yeah, powerlessness. Right.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've done that bucket justice.
All right. Bucket 1, connection.
Bucket 1.
There are 3 buckets, right?
3 buckets. I gave them all C's, so you would have some alliteration. So bucket 2, C. Bucket 2, I'm going to call culture, right? And in the setting of frontline healthcare workers, I'm going to say creating a culture in the workplace environment that will be protective at times of emotional distress. So I feel like I'm asking you guys more questions than you might want, but I'm going to do another one.
It's good. I like it.
I just flip it around on you guys. You guys, Eric and Alex, are you 100% safe from this virus?
No,
right? No. None of us are. And yet we know that creating a sense of safety and security and comfort is deeply helpful in the setting of emotional distress or trauma, right? It's very buffering for your psyche. So my follow-up question is, would you say that there are some of our colleagues who are concerned about having adequate resources available to optimally protect their physical health while doing this work?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Right? Like you're like, duh, Dani, like look at the news, right? We're hearing this, like they're screaming it at us, right? They're so scared that there isn't enough protection, enough PPE, enough reliable guidelines around PPE to feel safe in their moment to moment work, right? Mm-hmm. People are questioning even like the motivation behind the guidelines. Is this because of what would really keep me safe, or is it because of supply? And is it because of money, right? They're going home and Googling, like, how do I sterilize my masks? And this feeling of being inadequately protected, it's bleeding out of the doors of the hospital, right? Am I going to get my kids sick because of this? Am I going to get my mom sick because of this? Have no doubt whatsoever that this extra bonus level of concern about safety and about if the system values my safety is having a deep psychological impact on people, far beyond like the safety from the virus itself.
Right. So the whole fact that nursing homes account for about like half the deaths in the U.S., and yet nursing homes are given far less PPE, testing, etc. The people who work in those nursing homes just must feel so devalued, unsupported because of that choice that we're making as a society, and that the culture within the nursing home must be one of, not feeling like you're in a supportive cultural environment. Is that
totally.
Sort of what you?
Yeah. No, it is like heartbreaking to watch people sacrifice so much and at the same time be questioning if leadership, if administration actually even cares about them. Right?
But what can you do about that? So like, as a healthcare worker, I could express support for a colleague and try and establish connection with them. But I can't, other than, being
you don't
activist.
have a sewing machine over there.
Right.
Making little masks out.
Well, I think the concern is that you don't want to you don't want to tell people, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
When it's not, because that could further increase distrust. And, it's interesting we're using the word perception of safety. We also don't want to falsely state that everything's going to be fine.
Totally. Right. So yeah, we have to actually try to get the equipment that people need. But I think you're right on, Eric. Like, how different would it be if your leadership said something like, you're right, this is unideal, right? We're going to do our best to improve. We want to work with you and troubleshoot the best ways to keep you safe with the resources we have while we're still trying to get more resources. That's such a different message than, no, you're delusional, right? This is a non-issue. There's no safety concern here. Either way, we still want to get people more masks, but there's a very different cultural feeling based on the message that we're sending around people's sense that they're not cared for, that their safety isn't important.
Mm-hmm. So connection, culture.
Well, culture, you're moving forward. And I'll say that just sort of gets at, we have to put words to it. A big piece of culture is effective leadership and communication, right? Children who experience trauma are incredibly buffered by having a reliable, solid primary caregiver in their lives. It's not totally analogous, right? Like it's not the same thing, but I would say that having a reliable, solid leadership, supervisor, administrator in your workplace setting who you feel is trustworthy and has your best interests at heart is going to be huge as a piece of emotional PPE right now. Fair? And I would even say, I think the last time I was here, I was bashing like algorithms and things like that. But I would say having reliable algorithms in place right now so that people have guidance on like, how do I manage resources when there aren't enough? How do I like manage remains, manage goodbyes, manage all of these things is going to protect from the isolation and the moral distress that comes with people having to make these unideal decisions seemingly alone, right? That all falls under like culture. How do we create a workplace culture where people are, protected more emotionally?
Yeah. Third bucket?
Third bucket, C. Do you have any guesses?
Carrots. Eat carrots.
Third bucket I'm going to call coping.
Connection,
right?
culture, and coping. The 3 buckets.
Yeah. How do we support coping? So what about you? Like, do you guys have go-to coping strategies?
Yes.
So wait, let me say it again. Do you have go-to healthy coping strategies?
No.
Change your answer if you need to.
I bike. I bike 5 or 6 times a week, and love it.
I mean, actually, I think every time I've seen you, Alex, you've just gotten off a bike ride that's longer than my cumulative bike riding for the last 36 years of my life. But, yeah. How about you, Eric? Do you have a go-to?
I did some gardening this weekend. It was great.
It was great. Yeah. No, there are like so many things we know are effective. Self-compassion, exercise, yoga, meditation, quality time with loved ones. Right? I think you talked about donning and doffing emotions, but yes, Eric, I'm gonna hold you on that. We talked last time about this, using the times when we change our masks and wash our hands as like these symbolic rituals to cleanse, our inner experience. And I just heard that Eric Wadera is going to be hosting a guided meditation every Monday at lunchtime.
Hopefully not.
Just kidding. That's false. But Stanford is, and it's a real thing. It's open to everybody. Like Stanford does these guided meditations at lunchtime, and Headspace is free now for healthcare workers. There's so much stuff out there, and we know that people who at baseline have healthy coping strategies are going into this pandemic with more of an emotional buffer, right? Mm-hmm. And that's in part because they decrease stress. Fair enough. But it's also because there's a sense of empowerment that we feel when we have the belief that there are things we can do to manage and impact our own emotions, right? And that's protective. So we have to be asking, how do we encourage frontline workers to access their strategies, right? And how do we create access and education around developing and strengthening coping strategies right now? And then what do we do if that's not enough?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, like even when you bring up guided meditation, is that my work life takes up a large portion of my day. And like, I kind of want to just get done with my work and get home to these other things that are important to me. And the idea of doing something, which I know would probably be very healthy for me, like guided meditation, sounds great. But on my list of priorities, it will not fit in. Like, how do you deal with that when like your day is already full and then somebody's saying, oh, now you have to attend this guided meditation class at noon?
Well, in part, I would say, pick the things that you like, because they're not going to feel like checklist things, right? There's a menu of stuff that's helpful. So pick the ones that call to you. Maybe the thing you're going to do at home with your family is actually the best form of coping for you. But I think the other thing I would say, as an advocate for mental health, is what if I asked you, Eric, I get it. I don't want to get infected by this virus, but gosh, the sweating and the discomfort and the itchiness of like putting on the mask and the gown and stuff and then taking it off and having to wash my hands, like it makes me like 3 minutes too late and I get this kind of rash on my face. But I just, I get it. It's probably good for me, but...
We're starting to hear that. The PPE burnout. Like people are just so sick of all of this. I get your argument though, that there are some things that we should do because it does protect us.
Because it does protect us. And I think, the other piece is we need to be ready for like, if those things aren't enough, like what do we do next?
Yeah.
Right. Would you guys say, how do I put it? Would you say you have a good sense of like what symptoms would make you want to test yourself for COVID?
It's growing day by day. Yeah.
Okay. Would you say you've got a
skin rash on my toes?
On your toes. My husband actually ran in today. He was like, "Look at my toes. Are they COVID toes?" I was like, "No, babe, you haven't left the house."
I actually just got tested today. Yeah, asymptomatic testing.
Because you had
it was oropharyngeal, and I gagged so hard that I grabbed the person's arm to push away. Like it was. I had trauma, Dani.
What do you think the person experienced?
I know.
Would you say then, having just been tested, you have like an equally sort of sophisticated understanding about, signs and symptoms of stress reactions to be watching for with yourself that might trigger you like, hey, I need more support. I need more mental health screening right now. Personal mental health risk factors, things in that vein.
If I had to grade myself from elementary school to medical school, as far as where I am with that, I'd probably be at somewhere around 3rd or 4th grade.
I'll take that. 3rd or 4th graders are impressive. But no, like we do need to, we've educated people so much around the virus, but we haven't done a lot of work educating people about, this is what a stress reaction is. This is what a red flag is that you need a little bit more. This is how you get a mental health screening, right? Uh-huh. All these things we know about the infection, so little we know about how we protect on the other side of it.
Wait, so what is a stress reaction?
There's a lot that comes out in stress reactions. I don't think we can go through it all, but some of the big ones that come to my mind are disturbed sleep. Right? If you start seeing disturbed sleep without a clear reason, right? It's not like a pager going off. Mm-hmm. If you start getting somatic symptoms, right? Headaches, body aches that aren't normal for you. If you find that you're like irritable, angry, distracted, isolated without a clear reason why, none of these mean you're doing anything wrong, right? We're in a profoundly stressful situation, but those are the types of things that you see in a stress reaction that would be little red flags for me saying, okay, this person needs more coping. This person needs maybe a mental health evaluation or more support. But we should all know this. Like, gosh, I wish that colleague on the front lines, days before she got to where she got, knew that and was able to say, okay, these red flags are coming up.
Right? And just because I never thought about before is when psychiatrists like you say the word coping, is there a definition that you use? Like, what is coping? See, I told you, I'm a 3rd grader. Like,
I feel like I'm on. Yeah. What is that show? Like, am I smarter than a 5th grader? I feel like I'm on that show. I'm a 3rd grader.
I may have to repeat 3rd grade here.
Coping is just how we deal with or process the feelings that we're having, right? Coping itself is not a good or bad thing, right? There's unhealthy coping. Ooh, I have a feeling I don't like. I'm going to go drink and eat 10 ding dongs, right? And then there's healthy coping. Oh, I have this feeling I don't like. What can I do to deal with it, to process it, to be able to tolerate it?
Yeah, probably a lot of what people are seeing is rates of alcohol intake pretty much gone up dramatically, pretty much everywhere.
Is that right?
And a lot of people using alcohol to cope with this, I won't even say social distancing. It's often social isolation, worry about the pandemic, worry about safety, and certainly worry that healthcare providers are doing the same.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I would say then that the last piece of this coping bucket, right, is that we need to have accessible psychological support very easily available as a form of PPE. Mm-hmm. Right? And not only just accessible, right? Because we know that accessing support, not everyone's going to need it, but for people who do, it's obviously going to be a protective factor. But, you guys are both in psychiatric treatment right now, right?
In the last 45 minutes I've been.
That's too funny. No, I don't. Fair answer. Don't answer the actual question though, because I would never ask you that question, but it will lead me to my next question, which is, you guys have been working in medicine for a long time. How psychologically easy do you think it is for most of us in medicine to say, Okay, yeah, I'll sign up for formal mental health care. Yeah, sure.
Incredibly hard. Like again,
Incredibly hard.
we got busy schedules. We're working during the day when those things are happening. We are, I think, you hear plenty of stories about when people, have problems and they submit it that they're also put in a bureaucratic system that it may have ramifications as far as their career, as far as what they have to do. Yeah.
Let me add to that. I remember when I was in residency, I worked with a pair of chief residents, a pair of folks who had been former chief residents of a distinguished hospital, which I won't name. And one of the sayings from that hospital was, "The strong will be strong and the weak will be weak." The strong will be strong and the weak will be weak. So there's this, culture, if we're going to go back to the other C, of, asking for help, showing signs of weakness is, not desirable. And working your way through it, toughing it out, grinding it out is a sign of strength. And I think that's true, not just in that hospital, because that would be unfair, but sort of culturally, it's part of the hidden curriculum in medicine. As we break people down through grueling years of medical school and internship and residency and clinical fellowship, and then we build them back up in ways that are analogous to military boot camp. And so I think there is this, embedded within the culture. We did this study on crying in medicine at one point, and we asked people, medical students and interns, what their experience was with attendings who are crying. And their experience was, as soon as they start crying, they leave and they hide and they're embarrassed, and they don't talk about it. So there's this hidden curriculum here that sort of ingrains in us that we, asking for help is generally not something to be desired in medicine, and it's something potentially even to be ashamed of.
Yeah, what a sad commentary. We're like, help yourselves, but don't. Right? And so I think that you guys are sort of spot on, and this is one of my soapboxes. There's probably like a warning sign, like, warning, she's about to get on a soapbox. But this is one of my biggest problems with medical culture. Right? And if we really want to have this emotional PPE, then we have to say that as important as access is the need to normalize and even celebrate the importance of mental health care right now. Right? We need to take like an unequivocal, strong stance in saying that we would rather a healthcare provider that takes the steps to care for their mental health over the one you described, Alex, right? Over a healthcare provider that just toughs it out and ignores the problem. Right? And hand in hand with that is the message that we would rather celebrate the bravery of healthcare providers who ask for help than mourn the loss of one more hero for whom suicide is less intimidating than reaching out. There's a reason that doctors have such a high suicide rate, right? There's a profound impact that our bias against psychological illness has had on ourselves and our colleagues, and it's time for us to be accountable for it. I'll come off my soapbox, but
yeah, no, that's great. And in the spirit of normalizing, I've sought psychological help, mental health counseling on 3 different occasions I can think of offhand for myself and relationships and family issues, and I found it tremendously helpful in all cases. And I encourage people to seek it out and try it, and don't feel like you're shamed or suffering alone, and that there are there resources, Dani? Like, are there specific resources for people in the time of coronavirus? What numbers can they call, or who can they reach? How much of this is local, or are there national resources?
Yeah. And I want to start just by thanking you for that disclosure, because I think that is how we do it, right? We just have to really own our own like vulnerability as humans. We can't expect our colleagues to do it if we can't do it. So thank you, Alex. There are a lot of resources, a lot. I don't know all of them. So, there are national hotlines that we can put the numbers to on the podcast page that people can call sort of 24/7. I know in San Francisco, we have a whole like network of pro bono psychiatrists who are willing to do this work for free via video with any healthcare worker that needs that support. I know in New York, they have the same thing going on. There are things like apps and stuff that might be less intimidating. But what I was wondering, and maybe if I just ask you on air, you guys will be less likely to say no, but I was wondering if we could actually make an emotional PPE resources page on GeriPal where we could try to put these all together, because I can't tell you how many of these efforts I'm seeing on all my different psych pages. And I think if people could write in and we could accumulate all the national things available, all the local things available, so that people know what they have access to, that'd be a nice organizing thing we could do for everyone, because there's a lot.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yes.
We're going to rely on you. So our listeners too, if you have other resources, we'll have a main menu bar titled Emotional PPE. How about that, Dani?
Love it.
With all the things that we talked about there today. And some of them are great. Dani mentioned things like Headspace, free app for healthcare providers. Dani, the last question I have for you, because there is some concern amongst like physicians about, like physician health programs, these state programs,
caring for the caregiver.
Yeah, and your license is also dependent. Like if you get reported to these, your license is dependent on completing them. And I've heard that it's like a big business now too.
Yeah.
How does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, it's a sad commentary on the whole medical field and medical culture. I think, how it fits in with emotional PPE. I think we need to, in the short term, make completely anonymous resources available. And that physician hotline for any physician across the country that you can call, it's like 7 a.m. to midnight and get a psychiatrist, is 100% anonymous. So I think we have to have that there, because people aren't just paranoid. Like, some of these concerns are legitimate. I understand why we're all so hesitant to seek out or disclose care. And I think on the other end of it, like, may this be time for a long overdue, change in how we treat these things. Because we have created a system that would rather an impaired physician go unchecked. How about every single person hashtag emotional PPE, and ask for a call to action, right, to change the way that healthcare deals with accessing mental health support. I wish I had a better answer for that one.
Sorry about that.
I could see your mouth moving, but it looked really profound, so I wanted to protect the listener.
I got my own mute button on the mixer.
That's so funny.
Is there anything else, any last thoughts, Dani, or last questions, Alex, that you have?
Not for me.
I think probably my last thought would just be a call to action. So for the individuals like the three of us who are listening to this podcast, please, right after you hear it, reach out, non-intrusively check in with somebody that who's on the front line. For the leaders who are listening, right, please don't just be mindful of emotional PPE, be champions of it, right? Champions of connection, of culture, of coping. And I guess the last one would be that in case there is someone out there who is feeling hopeless right now and listening to us talk, I promise you that I've seen many, many hopeless people, that I myself have been deeply hopeless at different parts in my life. And it is a feeling. And as with all feelings, new feelings await you, even if it's hard to see that right now. So please, please, please reach out for support if you need it, because I promise that you are valued and you are cherished. I'll leave it at that.
That was absolutely wonderful.
That's beautiful.
And it kind of aligns with our song, I Got You, Babe.
I got you, babes. We got you, babes.
We got you, babes.
We got you, babes.
We'll see.
Okay.
They say our love won't pay the rent. Before it's turned, our money's all been spent. I guess that's so we don't have a pot, but at least I'm sure of all the things we've got. Babe, I got you, babe.
Nice. Wow. Dani, it's always great to have you on.
So great to have you on, Dani. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you to our listeners. Thank you to Archstone Foundation for funding us.
Thank you to our colleagues on the front line. We see you. We see the heroic work you're doing. Sorry, I wasn't supposed to talk there, was I?
No, that was great. That's right. Yeah.
That was the first C.
It was nice.
And with that, good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.